Jake had been waiting all week for this morning. The sky was clear, the air was warm, and the little ranch lake behind his house was perfectly still, like a giant sheet of glass. It wasn't just any lake. It was part of his property, written into the deed when he bought the ranch. He'd been dreaming about putting his small fishing boat in the water ever since he moved in. Now, with a thermos of coffee in one hand and his fishing rod in the other, he was finally going to do it. His boat wasn't big, just a flat-bottomed aluminum one with a small electric motor. Nothing fancy, nothing noisy. He wheeled it down the gentle slope to the lake, the tires of the trailer crunching softly over the grass. The sun was just beginning to rise higher, turning the water a golden color. Somewhere in the trees, a few birds called out, and the whole scene felt peaceful, the kind of peace that makes you take a deep breath and think, "This is the life." Jake lowered the boat into the water with slow, practiced movements. He wasn't in a hurry. He wanted to savor every moment. He stepped inside, feeling the boat shift slightly under his weight, and then pushed off with the oar. The boat glided out over the calm surface. Jake smiled to himself as ripples spread out behind him. From the lake, he could see more of the neighboring subdivision across the road. It was one of those neatly planned neighborhoods where every house looked almost the same. The lawns were trimmed to the exact same length. Jake had never paid much attention to them before. The houses were far enough away that they didn't bother him, or so he thought. He dropped his fishing line into the water, letting the bobber float lazily. He was just about to take his first sip of coffee when he heard it, the faint sound of voices, sharp and cutting through the still air. He turned his head and saw 3 people standing at the far end of the shore, where the view of the lake was best from their side. 2 women and 1 man, all holding their phones like they were filming a wildlife documentary. One of the women, a tall, thin lady with sunglasses perched on her head, pointed at him like she'd just spotted a fugitive. Her voice carried over. "The water? Hey, you can't be out there." Jake was confused. He called back, "Why not? This is our lake," she shouted, her hands on her hips now. The man next to her nodded and said something Jake couldn't make out. Jake paddled a little closer, just enough so they could hear him better. "No, this is my property," he said calmly. "It's on my deed. The lake is part of my ranch." The tall woman scoffed, turning to the man and laughing like Jake had just told the funniest joke in the world. "No, you don't understand," she said loudly. "This is community property. You can't just bring a boat in here without HOA approval." Jake blinked. HOA? Approval? This was news to him. "I don't live in your HOA," he replied, still keeping his voice steady. "This lake isn't part of your subdivision." That only seemed to make her angrier. She took a few steps closer to the edge of the water, her shoes sinking slightly into the mud. "Listen, sir, we have rules. You can't just put boats in here. It's dangerous for the wildlife, and it's against our guidelines." Jake shook his head. "Your rules don't apply to my land." "I'm sorry, but you're mistaken." The woman's face twisted into a smug smile. "We'll see about that. Call in the cops." She pulled her phone out like she'd been waiting all morning for this moment. The other woman beside her, shorter, with a bright pink jogging outfit, chimed in. "Yeah, you can't just float in here. We have every right to stop you." Looked at them for a moment, then back out at the quiet lake. The absurdity of the situation almost made him laugh. Here he was, fishing on his own property, and these strangers thought they had some kind of authority over him. "Go ahead and call," Jake said finally, his tone still calm. "I'll be right here when they arrive." That seemed to catch them off guard. The tall woman narrowed her eyes, as if she expected him to panic and row away, but Jake wasn't going anywhere. He leaned back, took a sip of his coffee, and let his line drift in the water. The HOA trio huddled together, talking in low voices, probably deciding exactly what to tell the police. Jake could hear fragments, words like trespassing, safety violation, and reckless behavior. It was ridiculous, but he wasn't worried. He knew the lake was his, with the papers to prove it. If anything, he was curious to see how the police would react when they found out they'd been called for something so petty from across the water. He could still see the tall woman with the sunglasses pacing back and forth while she spoke into her phone. She was gesturing wildly, pointing toward Jake like she was narrating a crime in progress. The pink outfit woman was recording video now, probably planning to post it online with some dramatic caption. The man, meanwhile, stood with his arms crossed, nodding at every word the women said. Jake couldn't help but wonder how boring their lives must be if this was the most exciting thing happening to them all week. The air stayed still, except for the occasional splash of a fish breaking the surface. Jake's bobber dipped once, twice, but he didn't even move to reel it in. He was more entertained by the strange scene unfolding on the shore. He thought about how the lake had been one of the main reasons he bought the ranch in the first place. The previous owner had told him stories about peaceful evenings out on the water, catching bass as the sun set. Jake had imagined many mornings just like this one, except without the shouting neighbors and police calls. Still, he refused to let them ruin it for him. If they thought they could intimidate him, they were in for a surprise. After about 5 minutes, the tall woman suddenly spoke into her phone in a louder voice. Yes, he's still here. Yes, he's refusing to leave. Yes, we feel threatened. Jake nearly choked on his coffee. Threatened? He was sitting in a boat holding a fishing rod. The most dangerous thing in his hands was a worm on a hook. The woman ended the call and looked straight at Jake with a satisfied smirk. Police will be here any minute, she said, like she'd just delivered the final blow. Jake smiled back politely. Good, they can clear this up. That made her frown, and for a moment she seemed unsure. She probably expected him to get nervous, maybe even rowed ashore and apologize. Instead, he just sat there, legs stretched out, enjoying the gentle rocking of the boat. The HOA trio stood in an awkward little cluster now, occasionally glancing toward the road, waiting for the flashing lights to appear. Jake took another sip of coffee, the warmth filling him with a kind of stubborn satisfaction. He wasn't moving an inch until this nonsense was resolved. It was funny, he thought. 8 minutes ago, the morning had been nothing but peace and sunshine. Now it had turned into something out of a small-town drama, and the main character was him, the man in the boat who dared to fish on his own property. He didn't know it yet. But those 8 minutes were going to change more than just his Saturday. It didn't even take 10 minutes. Jake had barely finished his coffee when the sound of engines came from the road. First a low rumble, then the crunch of tires on gravel. 2 patrol cars appeared, their red and blue lights flashing against the water. The sound was loud in the otherwise quiet morning, and it seemed way too dramatic for what was actually happening. A man in a boat, fishing on his own lake. The HOA group immediately straightened their backs like soldiers at attention. The tall woman in sunglasses waved her arms toward the patrol cars as if she were guiding in an airplane. "Over here," she called. Her voice had a tone of urgency, as though Jake were in the middle of committing some serious crime. Both cars stopped near the edge of the road, and 2 officers stepped out. One was a tall man with a weathered face and calm eyes. The other was younger, maybe in his late 20s, with a notepad already in his hand. Walked over to work the HOA group, who wasted no time jumping into their story. "He's trespassing," the tall woman said loudly, pointing across the water at Jake. "He just showed up with a boat and started fishing. We told him it's against our HOA rules and he refused to leave. He's breaking community guidelines and damaging the lake." Jake could hear every word. He sat there in the boat, unmoving, his fishing line still in the water. The younger officer looked over at him, then back at the group. "Is the lake part of your neighborhood's property?" he asked. "Yes," the tall woman said quickly, as if the question had been an open goal she could easily score. "It's shared property for the homeowners. This kind of behavior is dangerous, but before she could finish, the man in the pink jogging suit added, "and disrespectful. We've had issues with people like this before. They just think they can do whatever they want." The officers listened without interrupting. The younger one scribbled notes. The older one kept glancing at Jake, who still hadn't moved. Finally, the older officer cupped his hands and called out, "Sir, can you come to shore so we can talk to you?" Jake rowed in slowly, making sure to keep his movements calm. The boat touched the bank. He stepped out, pulled it partly onto the shore, and looked at the officers. "Morning," he said evenly. "Morning," the older officer replied. We got a call that you're trespassing on HOA property. Can you tell me what's going on? Jake nodded. Sure, this is my property. The lake is on my deed. I live. Over there, he pointed toward his ranch house. It's visible beyond a patch of trees, and I've got the paperwork to prove it. The HOA doesn't own this water, and their rules don't apply here. The younger officer flipped a page in his notebook. Do you have those documents? Yes, in my truck, Jake said. Walked calmly to where his pickup was parked near the shore and pulled out a folder. Inside were the original property documents, including the deed and a map that clearly showed the lake within his boundary lines. He handed the papers to the older officer, who studied them carefully. Then the officer passed them to the younger, one who read them just as thoroughly. The taller man's lips twitched slightly, like he was holding back a sigh. Meanwhile, the HOA trio stood watching, their confidence starting to falter. The pink outfit woman crossed her arms and tapped her foot. The man looked down at the ground, avoiding eye contact. The tall woman, however, wasn't ready to give up. Officer, this can't be right, she said, stepping closer. Our community. Map shows the lake as shared property. This man doesn't even live in the neighborhood. He's putting our wildlife at risk. The older officer straightened up and turned to her. Ma'am, according to the county records, this lake is fully within his property. There's no shared ownership, and there's no law being broken here. The words hit the group like a bucket of cold water. But the tall woman began, but the officer held up his hand.
Hey, ma'am.
This is a civil matter at best. If you believe there's an error in the property records, you can take it up with the county. But as far as we're concerned, this gentleman is doing nothing illegal. Jake stayed quiet, just letting the facts speak for themselves. The younger officer handed him back his documents with a small nod. Everything looks in order, he said. The HOA group looked like they'd just bitten into something sour. That man muttered something about needing to check the bylaws. The pink outfit woman was scrolling on her phone, maybe trying to find some proof to back up their claim. The tall woman, however, wasn't done. Fine, she said sharply. If the police won't enforce the rules, we'll take this to the county. We'll get the lake declared as community property, and then he won't be able to just do whatever he wants.
Ow.
Jake met her gaze calmly. You can try, he said. But the county records have been the same for decades. This lake has always been private. The older officer gave a polite but firm nod to both sides. All right, folks, there's nothing more for us to do here. We'd appreciate it if 911 calls were reserved for emergencies. This isn't one. His tone was professional, but there was an edge to it, a hint that they'd dealt with this kind of nonsense before. The younger officer added, Ma'am, sir, please understand, HOA rules are not the same as law. They can't override property deeds. The tall woman's face flushed a deep red. She opened her mouth as if to argue, but then she just turned on her heel and marched back toward the subdivision, her two allies trailing behind. The police gave Jake a quick nod before heading back to their cars. As they drove off, the flashing lights faded, and the sound of the engines grew distant. The lake was quiet again. The ripples from Jake's boat slowly smoothed out, and the air felt peaceful once more. But the peace was different now.
Ow.
Was a tension underneath it, the kind that comes when you know a fight isn't over. Jake stood at the shore for a moment, looking across the water toward where the HOA houses sat in perfect little rows. He had the strong feeling this wouldn't be the last time they tried something. Still, he couldn't help but smile. The whole encounter had been ridiculous, but it had also confirmed what he already knew. The lake was his. He had the proof. And no amount of angry neighbors or flashing lights could change that. He pushed his boat back into the water and climbed in, deciding to finish what he'd started. As he drifted back toward the center of the lake, he thought about how strange people could be so quick to claim control over something that wasn't theirs, somewhere deep down, though he also knew they'd just made a big mistake. By trying to challenge him, they'd given him a reason to dig deeper, to make sure they never pulled something like this again. And in the back of his mind, an idea was starting to form, an idea that would change the situation completely in his favor. Jake woke up the next morning expecting peace, but instead, the first thing he saw when he stepped onto his porch was a group of HOA members gathered at the far side of the lake. They weren't fishing. They weren't relaxing. They were holding clipboards, pointing at the water and talking in sharp, clipped voices. It didn't take much to guess what they were doing, plotting their next move. The memory of yesterday's police visit was still fresh. While Jake had hoped that being proven right in front of the officers would settle things, he wasn't. Naive. People like this didn't give up that easily. He had seen enough to know that their pride wouldn't let them admit they were wrong by mid-morning. The tall woman in sunglasses, the same one who had called the cops, showed up at the edge of the lake again. This time, she was holding a thick folder. 2 other HOA members were with her, one of them carrying a tripod with some kind of surveying equipment. She spotted Jake working near his barn and walked right toward him with the kind of confidence only people with false authority seem to have, Mr. Dalton. She called out, using his last name like they were in a courtroom. We have reviewed our records, and we've discovered there's a shared water rights agreement. This means you cannot use the lake without HOA approval. Jake leaned against the barn door, wiping his hands on a rag. Really? He said, his voice calm. I'd like to see that agreement. The tall woman smiled like she had just won a prize. We will be providing you a copy from the county office soon. But in the meantime, we're formally requesting that you stop using the lake until the matter is resolved. Jake raised an eyebrow. You don't have a copy yet? We're retrieving it, she said quickly. In other words, Jake replied, you don't have proof. The woman's smile tightened, but she didn't back down. We know it exists. Jake could have ended the conversation right there, but instead he decided to play along. If they wanted to dig a hole, he would happily hand them a bigger shovel. All right, he said slowly. I'll wait to see this agreement. Bring me the official document. Until then, I'll keep using my property as I always have. The woman's eyes narrowed. You're making a mistake. Jake almost laughed. Maybe, he said. But let's wait and see. She turned sharply and marched back toward the others, muttering something to the man with the tripod. Started measuring distances from the shoreline, jotting notes on their clipboards as if they were building a legal case. For the rest of the day, Jake went about his chores, occasionally catching sight of them skulking around the far end of the lake. He wasn't worried. If there really had been a shared water rights agreement, the county records would have shown it. The police would have mentioned it yesterday. This was just another bluff. 2 days later, the bluff collapsed. Jake was sitting at his kitchen table having lunch when his phone buzzed. It was a call from the county clerk's office. The woman on the line explained that an HOA representative had come in demanding a copy of a supposed shared water rights document. They had been very pushy, insisting it must be on file. But there was nothing. The clerk had patiently shown them the property records, which clearly stated that the lake had been sold in full to the previous ranch owner more than 30 years ago. There were no easements, no shared rights, and no mention of the subdivision anywhere in the deed. The best part, the clerk said, was that the HOA members hadn't taken it well. The tall woman had argued for nearly 20 minutes, accusing the county of losing the document. The clerk had simply pointed to the official file and said, "If it's not here, it doesn't exist." Jake thanked the clerk and hung up, a slow smile spreading across his face. He imagined the HOA members' faces when they realized they had absolutely no legal claim. It was the kind of satisfaction you couldn't buy. Later that afternoon, he saw them again at the lake's edge. They weren't measuring or pointing anymore. Instead, they stood in a tight huddle, speaking in low voices. When they noticed him watching, the pink outfit woman gave an awkward little wave. But the tall woman didn't look up. Jake walked over, taking his time. When he reached them, he said, "So, did you find your document?" The tall woman's jaw tightened. "The county's files are incomplete," she said stiffly. "This isn't over." Jake smiled faintly. "Of course. But just so you know, the county clerk called me today. They were very clear. The lake is mine. Always has been." The man in the group shifted uncomfortably. "Look, we just want clear rules for everyone's safety," he mumbled. Jake shrugged. "I already have clear rules. It's called property. Law." There was a long, tense silence. Finally, the tall woman turned away. "We'll discuss this at our next board meeting," she said. "Sounds great," Jake replied. Make sure to invite me." They left without another word, their earlier confidence now replaced by something else. The quiet frustration of people who had lost but didn't want to admit it. Jake watched them go, the breeze rippling across the water behind them. Part of him wanted to just enjoy the victory and leave it at that. But another part of him, the part that hated being pushed around, was already thinking about the next step. He didn't want to just defend his rights. He wanted to make sure they never tried this again. That thought lingered in his mind for the rest of the evening. By nightfall, it had turned into a plan. The plan came together faster than he expected. The next day, Jake got a call from someone. He knew the elderly widow who owned a narrow strip of land at the far end of the lake. It wasn't much, just about 20 feet of shoreline. But it technically meant the HOA still had a small legal foothold on the water. She'd heard about the police incident and the HOA's nonsense. "I'm tired of their drama," she told Jake over the phone. "If you want my piece of the shore, I'll sell it to you. I'd rather it go to someone who'll use it than people who just argue over it." Jake nearly dropped the phone. This was the opportunity he hadn't even known he was waiting for. "How much?" he asked. She named a number that was surprisingly reasonable. Jake didn't even bother negotiating. "Deal," he said instantly. By the time the call ended, his earlier irritation had turned into something close to excitement. The HOA had tried to bluff their way into controlling his lake, and now, without realizing it, they'd set the stage for him to take away their last shred of influence over it. The paperwork would take a little time, but Jake already knew how this was going to end. Once that strip of land was his, the lake would be 100% under his control. No more arguments, no more police calls, no more fake rules, and when that day came, he was going to make sure the HOA understood exactly what that meant. The phone call from Mrs. Turner had been short, but it stayed in Jake's mind all night. He could barely sleep, thinking about what it meant. Mrs. Turner was the widow who owned that narrow strip of land at the far edge of the lake, a strip so small you could walk across it in less than a minute. But it was still technically part of the shoreline. The subdivision's HOA liked to pretend that because Mrs. Turner's property touched the water, they had some kind of claim over the lake. In reality, it was a flimsy excuse, but it was enough for them to stir trouble whenever they wanted. If Jake bought her land, that excuse would disappear forever. The lake would be his completely, legally, undeniably. When the sun came up, Jake didn't waste time. He made a pot of coffee, grabbed his truck keys, and drove over to Mrs. Turner's place. Her house sat at the very end of a quiet lane, far from the neatly lined streets of the subdivision. The building was old but well kept, with a wide porch and a rocking chair that looked like it had been there for decades. Mrs. Turner herself was sitting in that chair when Jake pulled up. Wearing a faded sun hat and holding a mug, she smiled when she saw him. "You came quick," she said. "I wasn't going to let an offer like yours sit for long," Jake replied. She waved him toward the porch. "Come on up. I've got the papers ready." Jake climbed the steps and sat opposite her. From her porch, you could see a sliver of the lake glimmering between the trees. It wasn't much, but it was enough to make Jake's heart beat a little faster. Mrs. Turner handed him a manila envelope. "This is everything: the deed, the survey map, and the transfer forms. My lawyers already looked them over. We just need to get them signed and notarized." Jake opened the envelope and took a quick glance. Everything was in order. "You sure about selling?" he asked. She sighed. "Jake, I'm too old to be dealing with the HOA. They've been pestering me for years about this land, trying to pressure me into letting them manage it. I know how they are. I've seen how they treated you. I want this piece to go to someone who won't let them push their way in." Jake nodded. I can promise you that." They shook hands right there on the porch. Jake offered to drive her into town to get the paperwork notarized, and she agreed. It took less than an hour to make it official. When the last form was signed, Jake was the proud owner of the final 20 feet of shoreline. Driving back to the ranch, he felt a deep satisfaction settle in his chest. The lake was now 100% his. Not partially his, not shared his. There was nothing the HOA could say, no loophole they could find, no meeting they could hold that would change it. Still, Jake knew one thing: they weren't going to like this. and that made him want to break the news in a way they wouldn't forget. That afternoon, he parked his truck near the lake, close enough for the subdivision residents to see. He started unloading long wooden posts, a roll of fencing wire, and a few large boards. He didn't actually need to fence anything. The property line was already clear, but he wanted to make it obvious to anyone looking that something had changed. Sure enough, within half an hour, a few curious HOA members appeared at the far bank. First came the man in the polo shirt, then the pink outfit woman, and finally the tall woman in sunglasses. They stood in a little group, watching him hammer the posts into the ground. "What are you doing?" the tall woman finally called out. Jake didn't answer right away. He kept working until he'd finished a post, then turned toward them. "Just making some improvements," he said casually. "On whose property?" she asked, her voice sharp. Jake smiled. "Mine." The pink outfit woman frowned. "That's Mrs. Turner's land." "You can't just—" "I can," Jake interrupted, "because Mrs. Turner sold it to me this morning. I own every inch of this lake now. Every inch." The words hit them like a stone dropped into the water. You could almost see the ripples spread through the group. "That's impossible," the tall woman said. "She would never sell to you." Jake shrugged. "Well, she did. Signed, notarized, and filed. You can check the county records if you want." The man in the polo shirt muttered something under his breath, then turned and walked away. The pink outfit woman followed him. Only the tall woman stayed, glaring at Jake like she could undo the sale just by staring hard enough. "This isn't over," she finally said. Jake grinned. "Oh, I think it is." She turned on her heel and stalked off without another word. Jake went back to his work, but now he was smiling to himself. He wasn't just defending his property anymore. He had taken away their last piece of leverage. For years, they had probably enjoyed the idea that they had some kind of control over the lake. Now that illusion was gone. That evening, after the sun had dipped low and the water reflected streaks of orange and pink, Jake built a small dock at the edge of Mrs. Turner's old shoreline. It wasn't anything fancy, just a few planks and supports, but it was a statement, a symbol. He tied his boat to it, knowing that anyone looking from the subdivision could see it clearly. He also painted a sign, big enough to read from across the water. "Private property, enjoy the view from afar." The next morning, Jake sat on that dock with his coffee, watching the lake come alive with the sounds of birds and frogs. He noticed a few HOA members peeking from their yards, whispering to each other, clearly irritated. But none of them came over. None of them shouted. For the first time since this whole mess started, Jake felt completely at ease. He knew they might still try something, a letter, a complaint, maybe even another police call, but it wouldn't matter. They had no claim, no power, no way in. What they didn't realize yet was that Jake wasn't just protecting the lake for himself. He was protecting it from people like them, the kind who thought they could control everything they could see. And now the message was clear. This water wasn't theirs. It never had been. And now, thanks to one small piece of land and a determined rancher, it never would be. The sun was barely up when Jake stepped outside with his coffee. The air was cool, carrying the fresh scent of wet grass from the night before. He could see his lake from the porch, still, glassy and peaceful. The little dock he'd built the other day stood firm at the edge of the water, his boat tied neatly to it. And right beside it, the sign he had painted in bold letters gleamed in the soft light. "Private property, enjoy the view from afar." It had been 3 days since he bought Mrs. Turner's strip of shoreline. 3 days since the HOA had any kind of foothold on the lake. And in those 3 days, something strange had happened. Silence. Not one HOA member had come down to the lake. No one had tried to take photos. No one had shouted about rules or guidelines or wildlife. It was as if they had all agreed, quietly and without admitting it, that they'd lost. Jake wasn't the kind of man to gloat loudly, but he wasn't above enjoying the sight of them watching from a distance. Every now and then, when he went out in the boat, he would see 1 or 2 HOA members standing in their backyards, staring at him like they couldn't believe this was happening. Some would shake their heads, others would just turn and walk away. This particular morning, Jake decided it was the perfect time to take the boat out for a slow row across the lake. He grabbed his fishing rod, a small tackle box, and the coffee thermos, then untied the rope from the dock. The boat glided away smoothly, the water parting in gentle ripples. Halfway across, he looked toward the subdivision. Sure enough, there was movement, curtains shifting in a window, a figure pausing on a back porch, a pair of binoculars being raised by someone who clearly didn't want to be seen. Jake almost chuckled. They must hate this, he thought. Seeing me out here and knowing there's nothing they can do, he dropped his line into the water and let the bobber float. The quiet was deep, only broken by the occasional splash of a fish or the soft creak of the boat. It was the kind of peace he'd imagined when he first bought the ranch. The kind he thought he might never get back after the whole HOA ordeal started. Now it was his again, and it felt even better because of how hard he'd fought for it as the morning went on. Jake paddled to the far end of the lake, the part that used to belong to Mrs. Turner. He pulled up to the dock there, the one he'd built after buying the land, and stepped out. From this spot, you could see the subdivision's houses lined up like toy blocks, their identical roofs and lawns all perfectly in place. He stood there for a while, sipping his coffee, just looking at them. He wondered if they realized how quickly their little power play had backfired. They had tried to push him out of his own lake, and instead, they'd pushed him into owning more of it. By late morning, he headed back across the water. When he reached his main dock, he noticed something he hadn't seen before, a small envelope tucked under a rock near the sign. He set his fishing gear down and picked it up. The paper inside was folded neatly and typed. It's not handwritten. It was from the HOA president. The letter was surprisingly short. Mr. Dalton. While we may not agree on every detail, the HOA will no longer involve itself in matters regarding the lake. We ask only that you maintain it in good condition and respect the surrounding neighborhood. HOA President Jake read it twice. No threats, no accusations, just acceptance even. If it was reluctant, he couldn't help but grin. This wasn't an apology. He doubted they'd ever give him one, but it was as close as they were going to get. He folded the letter and put it in his jacket pocket. It would make a good story someday, but for now, he just wanted to enjoy. The day that afternoon, he decided to make things even clearer. He went into town and bought a second sign, a little smaller than the first, but with a message that left no room for interpretation. Private lake trespassers will be prosecuted. By evening, both signs were in place, one on his main dock and one on Mrs. Turner's old shoreline. The lake was quiet again, bathed in the soft orange of the setting sun. Jake sat on the dock with a cold drink, watching as the last light faded from the sky. He thought about how different things had felt just a couple of weeks ago. The shouting neighbors, the flashing police lights, the smug looks from people who thought they could control him. Now, it was just him, the water, and the sound of crickets starting their nighttime chorus. Over the next week, life settled into a new rhythm. Jake worked on the ranch during the day, fished when he wanted, and sometimes just floated out to the middle of the lake to watch the clouds drift by. The HOA stayed quiet. If they were still talking about him in their meetings, it didn't matter. Their words had no power here anymore. One Saturday, Jake invited a couple of friends over for a small cookout by the water. They grilled steaks, laughed, and told stories while the sun set. At one point, his friend Mike nodded toward the subdivision. They must be losing their minds over there, he said. Jake smirked. Probably. But they'll get used to it. People always do. Later that night, after everyone had gone home, Jake stood at the water's edge, looking at the reflection of the moon on the lake. He realized something important. This whole mess had been exhausting. Yes, but it had also reminded him why he'd bought the ranch in the first place. Not just for the land, but for the freedom. And now, thanks to a mix of stubbornness, luck, and a little help from Mrs. Turner, that freedom was untouchable. The lake was his. The peace was his. No HOA on earth could change that.